In this session, we're going to look at the basics behind exercise nutrition. And when we're looking at exercise nutrition, we're going to really think about the effects primarily of carbohydrate and proteins on consumption, on athletic performance. We'll also touch on legal supplementation. So things like creatine, some of the things that you might already know about, and caffeine, for example, and see how good are they. And then really at the end, we'll just talk about different somatotypes that people may have and how that relates to potential sport performance. That just means body shape. So a lot of which is genetically predetermined. So first of all, thinking, before proteins, which is coming up here, as we know, carbohydrates are a major source of energy during, in particular, aerobic exercise. But they're also a very big major protein sparer. So in other words, they prevent protein from being used as an energy source. So if you have enough carbohydrate in your system, that will allow you to not break down your muscle or other protein components during exercise, during prolonged exercise, to use as an energy source. Carbohydrates also, of course, aid in fat metabolism. They help prevent ketone formation, none of which you really want during exercise. And as we already know, we've got about 500 grams of glycogen stored in our bodies, about 400 grams of which is in our skeletal muscle, and another 100 grams which is in our liver. So proteins in general, unless we're doing very long levels or long time of exercise, don't contribute much towards energy provision during those exercise sessions. So what do people generally need during their daily lives? Well, the average is about 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight required per day. So in a 70 kilogram average male, it's 56 grams of protein required, and in a 58 kilogram female, it's about 44 grams. Okay, so those used to be the average weights of males and females many years ago, not so much anymore. So like I've said, what are the protein requirements? Well, actually, this work has actually been studied. So proteins are largely made of nitrogen, and you can measure nitrogen compounds in urine. And so what has been frequently done to look at the protein requirements in a body, in an individual, is to measure the amount of nitrogen loss, because that's an indicator of the amount of protein or protein requirement for the body. And what they found is, in many studies, they found that the sedentary, so average Joe Bloggs who doesn't really do anything, needs about 0.7 grams per kilogram of body weight. So that, if we're looking at the average amount required, is in that region of 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now, bodybuilders, of course, you'd expect them to require a lot more, but actually, when they looked at bodybuilders, they only needed about 0.82 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is really around the average amount that people use or require anyway. So it isn't the amount that people would have expected it to be. Of course, bodybuilders who work out for more than 2 or 3 hours a day may need a little bit extra supplementation because they're working out for longer. But as we'll all know, many bodybuilders take way, way in excess of that in terms of their protein requirement, in terms of their protein input, rather. And then if you look at your elite athlete, they actually require a lot more. They urinate out a lot of nitrogen, and therefore they have a greater requirement for protein in their diet. And that goes up to 1.4 grams per kilogram of body weight. So, but what you've got to bear in mind from this is the bodybuilders are far, far heavier as a general rule than an elite endurance athlete, who tend to be a lot slimmer. So whilst they might not need so much per kilogram of body weight, they will still require quite a lot of protein, so to speak. But the requirement per kilogram of body weight isn't as much as a lot of people expect. So that kind of leads us into the question to ask, are there any benefits to a high protein diet? So like I've also just mentioned to you, supplements are generally not required. Muscle mass doesn't increase just because you're eating high protein foods. And as we already know, any excess protein and amino acids taken into the diet, they're broken down, they're catabolized for energy, or they can get converted into glucose initially if it's required, and then go on to be stored as fat. So therefore, when do you require that extra protein? Well, protein, as I've said, is beneficial to those who exercise aerobically for extended periods. And we're talking several hours. We're not talking 1 to 2 hours. We're talking far more than that. Or those who exercise primarily with weights for extended periods again. And then what they say is a recommendation of somewhere between 1.2 to 1.7 grams per kilogram of body weight. So above that 0.8 zone for those who are doing quite a lot of extra work. And anyone who's taking more than 2 grams per kilogram is taking an excessive amount. It's never going to be realistically used. So are there any problems if someone does take too much protein? Now, in the short term, clearly not. But over the long term, it can potentially lead to some issues. So, for example, it can lead to dehydration, because what your body's doing is it's flushing out the excess nitrogen, and what's following with that are fluids and water. So this can leave you dehydrated, even though sometimes people don't feel any more thirsty than usual. Your kidneys also have to work that little bit harder to get rid of the extra nitrogen and the waste products of protein metabolism, which again isn't ideal. So anything above about 30% of total calories over the long term as protein can start to damage your kidney and potentially go on to lead to kidney stones as well. And that's all because of the enhanced amount of urea, which is a nitrogen product, for example, and other metabolites of protein metabolism. High protein diets have also been linked to an increase in cancer risk. That may in part be down to the higher levels of meat-based protein within those diets. So I think they have a higher risk if you're taking your red meats as opposed to taking your powdered supplements, for example. And increased fat storage. As we've just said, people often will get that weight gain often in the form of fat, because any excess protein gets converted into fat. If people are taking excess protein without carbohydrates, it can lead to bad breath, and that's because they're moving into a ketotic state. So they're becoming ketotic, and you're smelling those ketones on the breath. So there are potential adverse effects to taking too much protein in your diet over the long term. So what about fat? Well, we've talked about this one earlier, but fat is an important fuel both at rest and during prolonged low intensity exercise, and this is very similar to one I showed earlier on. So if you're walking at a low intensity, you primarily burn fat. If you start to work at your 65% of your VO2 max, your aerobic capacity, you're burning a decent amount of fat, both from the adipose tissue, that's really your blood fat, it's coming from your adipose tissue, and the muscle fat that you have, but you're also burning some carbohydrates, so muscle carbohydrates is coming from your glycogen. And then as you work harder, the amount of fat you use is decreasing, and that's because the lactic acid is inhibiting fat metabolism. So the overall fat usage starts to decrease for that reason. But as you can see, when you're walking at a very low level, exercising, you're really not using your muscle glycogen stores. And again, if you think about heart rate, because sometimes people often exercise based on their heart rate. If you say your average is 60 beats per minute, your max heart rate is roughly 220 minus your age. It's a very rough ballpark figure. So if you're a 20-year-old, when you're working at less than 60% of your maximum, that's your heart rate of about 120. You're almost exclusively using fat. So when on those machines that you see in the gyms where they say fat burning zone, that's really working at quite a low intensity where you're burning, primarily fat. So you're working at quite a low level, burning a lot of fat. And as you start to work harder and harder, you actually burn less fat and more carbohydrate. But you're still burning some fat, and you're definitely burning more calories. So what about carbs? So they are a very important fuel for your skeletal muscle to be able to work, in particular with endurance exercise. So during intense exercise, as we've just talked about, glucose in the form of glycogen, but also blood glucose, is really the preferred source. And your liver and muscle glycogen stores in those intense endurance events are down by 55 to 60% by an hour of exercise. And so when you're decreasing those stores by that amount, you're having to use other sources to compensate. When you're doing moderate exercise, your muscle supplies the energy from rest. Your muscle and liver provide 55% of that energy usage, if you like, and your fat is supplying the other 45%. And again, as your glycogen stores deplete, fat usage increases, and obviously fat metabolism is a bit slower. But on moderate to low exercise, that doesn't really matter. So are there any benefits? If we're looking at, you'll have heard about carbohydrate loading in the past. And so are there any benefits to a high carbohydrate diet prior to your prolonged, intense periods of exercise? Because it's only really necessary if you're doing intense, prolonged periods of exercise. What tends to happen is that people will do a loading phase over 3 to 4 days, where they increase gradually the total calories by carbohydrates up to 70 to 80%. And at the same time, they're starting to limit their training. So they're doing less exercise. If you look at the average diet, it's about 55% carbs, 15% protein, about 30% fat. That endurance, if you want to call it, that will last them, nearly 2 hours, 114 minutes. So, and that's the amount of glycogen they have per 100 grams of muscle. So roughly, okay, so they'll have about 1.7 grams present there per 100 grams. If people go on a low carb diet, which generally means high protein and high fat, okay, so your proteins go up and your fat go up and your carbs is practically at nothing, the amount of glycogen you now have stored is much, much less. It's almost a third less, 2/3 less. And you can only last less than an hour at that intensity because you don't have enough glycogen in your system. Whereas if you carb load over a period of days up to that 80% with a decent amount of protein, low level of fat, you can see that the amount of glycogen that you accumulate has greatly increased, more than doubled, meaning you can perform for longer at a higher intensity. So really what's that saying is that, carbohydrate loading does work because it boosts performance by increasing your endogenous, so the glycogen that is made within your body. And loading used to be done with a depletion phase, where you basically depleted your carbohydrates first. And that was very, very tough. So there were Australian marathon runners like Steve Monaghetti. He's written about the experience of going through these depletion phases and how he used to feel, have overwhelming fatigue. He was really irritable, reduced tolerance to anything from people to bugs to injury. And he had a marked reduction in performance, obviously, during that period. And really what's happening, the body, the brain, the muscles, they're all being deprived of carbohydrate as a fuel, and nothing really works that well in the short term. And what that meant with a lot of athletes who went through this phase, that carbohydrate restriction, they found it very hard to eat the high fat and the high protein intakes. And so in the end, they started to move on back onto carbs anyway, naturally, because it was quite unpleasant for them. So athletes tend not to follow that protocol anymore. But remember, for this to actually work, the carbohydrate loading only applies to intense, prolonged aerobic activity. For most athletes, okay, for Joe Bloggs, who does a lot of exercise and does a lot of runs or races or cycles or swims a lot of, a decent amount, a daily diet of somewhere between 60 to 65% carbs is perfectly adequate for them, and that will give them more than enough reserves for the events that you may be doing. So that's what a so if you're thinking about, carb loading, but what about a pre-competition meal? So you've got a race at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. What should you have beforehand? Well, generally, if you're doing long distance intense exercise again, it should be carbohydrate rich. And if it's solid food, it needs to be 3 to 4 hours before the event. And that allows it to have time for digestion and absorption into your system, because you really don't want food bouncing around in your stomach and your GI tract too much. You can have liquid carbs. That says barbs, so I do apologize for that. But you could have liquid carbs 1 to 2 hours before the competition. But what shouldn't you consume? Well, you shouldn't have foods that are high in fat and high in protein, because they basically sit in your system for longer. You shouldn't have high glycemic index carbs within 1 hour of exercise. High glycemic index just means that the food is released into your system, into your blood very, very quickly. Okay, and you don't want that before a competition, within 1 hour of that exercise. And that's really because what that does, if you think about the endocrine system and hormones, high carbohydrates entering your blood leads to an insulin spike. So you have high levels of insulin, which tries to dramatically reduce your blood glucose levels, but at the same time, it reduces lipid breakdown, lipolysis. And really, you don't want reduced lipolysis immediately before you're going to do some fairly high intensity, prolonged exercise, because decreased fatty acids means you have to rely on other fuel sources, which are going to run out sooner. Okay, so you actually have reduced performance by having those high glycemic carbohydrate drinks or foods within an hour of exercise. What about during exercise? Well, ideally, you need to, during those prolonged exercise, so your marathons and your long cycles, whatever it might be, you need to be taking that foods, those carbohydrates, those simple carbohydrates, those sugars. So you might take up to 60 grams per hour, so it's 240 calories. You might have drinks with 4 to 8% carbohydrate, which is fairly isotonic, so that it's same concentrate, so you're getting the fluids and you're getting the sugar coming in, and that helps to maintain the performance. So it maintains blood glucose levels and helps to delay fatigue. But what else? And so quickly, while it's in my head, why does that not cause an insulin spike, you might ask, and therefore reduce performance? Well, that's because during exercise you produce a lot of adrenaline, and that adrenaline inhibits insulin release. Okay, so you don't get that great insulin spike. So what else? I want you to think quickly before I'll pause it in a second. I want you to have a think. What else in sports drinks may be beneficial for performance? Okay, so obviously your electrolytes. When you're sweating a lot, you're sweating water, but you're also sweating electrolytes. So you might want to replenish your electrolytes, so your sodiums and your potassiums and your sugars that are lost during severe sweating. You might want a little bit for those endurance events that are very long. Okay, we're not talking 1 to 2 hours, we're talking long events. You may want some protein in that drink as well. So a protein to carb ratio, a 4 to 1 carbs to protein. That helps to delay fatigue, reduce muscle damage, but what it's really doing, that protein in that drink, usually is what it is, promotes protein metabolism that you're taking in through your system, and therefore it's decreasing amino acid breakdown or protein breakdown and amino acid release from your muscle during that prolonged exercise. So that's if you're going for a long cycle or a long run, for example. So if we're looking about those prolonged exercises during those endurance events like a marathon and beyond, what should you be having afterwards? Well, you do want your high GI foods to be consumed then. You want those sugary things to be coming in, so at 50, 60, 70 grams every couple of hours, because it helps to speed up muscle glycogen replenishment. The first few hours are the fastest, is the most efficient time for muscle glycogen replenishment. Because over the long term, it's about 5 to 7% replenishment per hour, which means if you've completely depleted, it's going to take around about 20 hours to replenish your liver and carbohydrate, your liver and skeletal muscle glycogen stores. Liver glycogen tends to be replenished much more quickly than skeletal muscle. Low GI foods at this stage aren't as beneficial. So your legumes, your milk products, your pastas at this stage, they're not quite as useful in those early stages. And protein addition early in carbohydrate replenishment helps to enhance the magnitude of glycogen resynthesis. So protein plus carbs, your glycogen it's just that little bit more effective at being replenished. So there, we talked just really at a very basic level. Okay, hopefully during the course of your degree and whatever else you might do afterwards, you'll get more in-depth information on that. But what we're going to do now is we're going to summarize some of the benefits of a couple of legal supplements that people may take to try and enhance their performance and really how they work. But again, it's at a very basic level. So caffeine, okay, that's one that we've all heard about. So where is caffeine? It's in your tea, it's in your coffee, it's in your Red Bulls, it's in lots and lots of things. But actually, the caffeine in your coffee isn't really very much good. It's not particularly good because there are other chemicals in there, and they seem to inhibit many of those beneficial effects of caffeine, because caffeine can be quite beneficial. So how is it metabolized and absorbed? Well, it's absorbed very rapidly. Your plasma levels after taking it in, they can peak within an hour or so. Your half-life clearance is about 3 or 4 hours, so it lasts. So basically, the half-life is how long it goes from full amount to half amount, and that's about 3 or 4 hours. So therefore, the effects are lasting a decent amount of time, 5 to 6 hours. You can take it as tablets. Okay, when I used to race, I used to take caffeine, and I used to take it as a tablet form. And so, just to have a look at, is it any good? Does it actually work? And I'll show you the dose in a second that works reasonably well. So this is just some studies that have done a long time ago where they looked at the effects of caffeine, which is your green, and your placebo. So they took something that they didn't know what it was, on swimming times, on split swimming times over 1,500 meters. And so what you can see from this is that the times were better at 500 meters, at 1,000 meters, and at 1,500 meters for those people who had taken caffeine. So how much do you need to take? Well, you need to take roughly 5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight before intensive endurance exercise. And what that caffeine appears to do is it increases fat catabolism, so fat usage. So you're more effective at using the fats within your system to provide energy. And because you're using those fats, you're not having such a requirement for carbohydrate. So therefore, you've got the carbohydrate stores for that little bit longer. And as I've said, you seem to get reduced split time for both swimmers and runners and cyclists and others. So it seems to be very, very good in that respect. In that respect, there isn't any dose response to it. So in other words, if you take 5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, you'll get a certain effect. If you take 10, you won't get any greater effect. If you get 15 milligrams per kilogram, you won't get any greater effect. You may get some of the side effects of caffeine, obviously. The other important thing to realize is that the effects of caffeine are reduced with tolerance. So in other words, you need to omit caffeine from your diet about 5-6 days prior to the competition to allow you to optimize its effects. So you need to basically, if you're a Red Bull drinker or whatever it might be, you need to stop taking that for 5 or 6 days before you then go on and take the correct amount. Okay, so if you're 100 kilograms in weight and you need 5 milligrams per 100 per kilogram, you would take 500 milligrams. That's quite a lot of caffeine. Okay, it's quite a lot of caffeine to take. So the other important factor that effect that it has is caffeine does cross the blood-brain barrier, so it gets into your brain, starts to affect your nervous system, and it also is very good at reducing the perception of effort during exercise and therefore the pain levels that you perceive. So it's good for that. There are lots of adverse effects, and they affect some people a lot more than they affect others. So they include restlessness, headaches, insomnia. Obviously, don't take it after 5 or 6 o'clock because it'll keep you awake. Some people get muscle tremors. Very common to have an increased heart rate and increased blood pressure. You might even feel that heart really pumping. So that's often an effect. And it's a diuretic. So it makes you wee more. That diuretic effect is lessened during exercise because you've got adrenaline release, which reduces renal blood flow, but it does act as a diuretic, so it's important to maintain your fluid intake. The next one, creatine. Again, another very, very common supplement that people take. It's present in meat, fish, poultry, and our bodies make about 1 gram per day, and it's stored in our skeletal muscle. So our skeletal muscle has got about 120 grams of creatine sitting in there. And we have different muscle types. I'll go over those in a second, and hopefully you know about them already, so from other courses you may have done. But we have type 1 and type 2A and 2B muscle fibers. So type 1 are the slow twitch, so therefore your endurance, and the type 2B are for your very fast twitch, for the kind of the sprinty events and the rapid, where you need rapid energy. And as you might expect from that, it's your type 2 muscle fibers that have more creatine than the type 1, because they're not the rapid energy requiring muscle fibers. They have about 5 times more creatine. So they're good. Those are those fast twitch fibers for sprint and power events, rather than the type 2 fibers for your slow twitch and your energy events. So what's the regime? Well, lots of you will have probably taken this. You probably know this very, very well. Most people will take about 20 to 30 grams per day for a week or so. That's your loading dose. And then a maintenance of around about 5 grams per day. And what are you actually trying to do? Well, actually, what you're trying to do, you're trying to make more of this phosphocreatine here. And by making more of this phosphocreatine, then when you start to do those short bursts of exercise, whatever it might be, around a football pitch or sprinting or power or whatever it might be, you've got this rapid supply of energy that you can quickly make here. So phosphocreatine breaks down to creatine with your ATP, which can be used to power your muscles. Because remember, phosphocreatine is the cell's energy reservoir to provide rapid ATP. Like we said, its main benefit is for those events up to about 5 or 6 seconds. Okay, so it doesn't last very long, but it does regenerate very quickly as well. It also does benefit people running performance up to about 1,000 meters, so about up to 1 kilometers. People have looked at that when they've taken about 30 grams a day for 6 days or so. So they've been taking quite high amounts. At the same time, people do gain in fat-free mass, and initially that's thought to be to the increased water within the muscle. And with training, you get an increase in protein synthesis. So really, some of the benefits, if we're looking at it in this little diagram here, again, you've got your creatine preloading and post-loading, and you can see that people with creatine can do more cycling sprint performance. So more work done, more kilojoules burned, as opposed to your placebo, where you're not getting that same effect. So there's benefits. It accelerates ATP turnover to maintain your power output. It delays phosphocreatine depletion because you've got more of it there. Decreases your dependence on anaerobic respiration. You've got more phosphocreatine there. You don't the requirement for anaerobic glycolysis, and with the production of lactic acid is decreased. So that's a good thing. And it facilitates recovery from repeated bouts of intense brief effort. You get faster ATP and phosphocreatine resynthesis, which can therefore be used again. Are there any risks of creatine? Not really. There are no major risks. Some people have some minor gastrointestinal disturbances, nausea, indigestion, for example. Some people will cramp up because your cells, your muscles become osmotically enlarged. So creatine goes into your muscles, and water follows, so they become osmotically enlarged. And it doesn't work for everybody. Some people don't respond to creatine supplementation, and that might be in part down to the muscle fibre they predominantly have. So if you are predominantly a type 1 muscle fibre, not as much creatine in there, and therefore you're not going to boost those numbers up quite so much and get those same benefits. It's also important to note that ingestion of caffeine and creatine together negates the effects of creatine. So really don't take them together is the moral of that story. So if you're taking creatine and you're hoping to benefit from it, you're going to have to kind of give up or decrease the amount of caffeine you're taking at the same time, because they don't work particularly well together. So the last one we're going to talk about, though there are lots of other ones, is bicarbonate. So bicarbonate, as we've previously talked about, it's an alkaline buffer, helps to prevent acid building up. It's a buffer against acid within our blood. And if you're looking at the regime, we'll talk about the potential benefits in a second. People will take around about 300 milligrams per kilogram of body weight of sodium bicarb a couple of hours before competition. Others will take sodium citrate, which minimizes the abdominal cramps and diarrhea that people sometimes get. And all that it's doing is it's increasing your blood pH before and after exercise, so increasing your performance, because it's buffering lactic acid buildup. But it also increases that lactate tolerance because, of course, you're working out, you're working hard, you produce lactic acid, and it's being buffered by this extra bicarbonate. So it increases that lactate tolerance. It mainly benefits 1 to 2 minute maximal effort exercises, or 6 to 8 minutes of arm or leg exercises. So you might be thinking, well, that take a 3K run for the fastest runners. Okay, so a 1500 for other people. Okay, so it benefits because of that lactic acid. You've got to be working at quite intense exercise levels. Very limited benefit to heavy resistance training because they're really not produced. They have lower anaerobic metabolic load. It doesn't benefit, so it's important to remember, it does not benefit those low intensity aerobic exercise events because they're not hurting the lactic acid levels are very near to resting levels, and they're not building up sufficiently for it to have a deleterious effect on your muscles, for example, because it builds up to such high levels. So here are some of the summary of what we've done. So creatine helps to improve strength and power performance. Caffeine, mental alertness, increases fat use. It's a carbohydrate sparer. And bicarbonate buffers your lactic acid and increases your lactate tolerance, possibly. There are lots of other supplements that we're not going to go through, some of which some of you might be taking. What about them? Try and find out. Get the real evidence. Ginseng, mental alertness, physical endurance, maybe, maybe not. Guarana, fatigue prevention, weight loss, maybe, maybe not. Amino acids, protein, gluconeogenesis precursor, definitely is a precursor for that, but we've talked about protein already. And then we got glutamine, which is a gluconeogenesis precursor as well, and inhibits cortisol, our stress hormone. So if you want to have a little look into more of those, great, but those are the main ones that people use legally are creatine, caffeine, and bicarbonate, because there's good evidence for them to be working reasonably well. So the last bit we're going to talk about is we're going to just really look at somatotypes. Okay, so that's really just looking at your physique, if you want to call it that, your body structure, and how that can possibly relate to sporting performance. Oh, so this is up here. So muscle fiber types. Okay, so these actually have different sizes, if you want to call it that. So they have different sizes and affect your muscle fiber type, affect your body structure. So remembering on your skeletal muscle types, you have your type 1, which is slow oxidative, type 2A, fast oxidative glycolytic, and your fast twitch glycolytic, your type 2Bs. So what I'd like you to do is just press pause in a second and just tell us the amount of myoglobin and mitochondria in each of those types, how rapidly they fatigue, the color of them, diameter, so the size basically, and max duration time, so how long can they go at exercising at a good level. Okay, so pause, work these things out yourself so they're nicely in your head, and then I'll go through them. Okay, so let's go through these. So myoglobin, how much myoglobin? That's an oxygen storer in your muscles, basically. So as you'd expect for those that are doing, so these type are your long aerobic exercise, and these are your sprinting events, and this is kind of in between. They've got a high amount of myoglobin, so lots of oxygen stored. Type 2A, medium. Type 2B, very little, because they're anaerobic. Mitochondria. You need lots of oxygen for your aerobic exercise, so you've got lots of those, moderate amount, and few in type 2B, because, again, it's anaerobic, and the mitochondria are aerobic. How quickly do they fatigue? Slowly, moderately, fast. Type 2, fatigue very fast. Again, they're anaerobic. Colour, red, good blood supply. Red, good blood supply. White, not such a good blood supply. What about their size? Type 1, narrow. Type 2A, medium. Type 2B, wide. Bigger muscles, basically. They are bigger muscles. So people with a lot of type 2B will look a lot bigger and a lot more muscular because the muscle fibers themselves are bigger. Max duration time, your type 1s can last for hours. Type 2As, less than 30 minutes as general. Type 2Bs, less than a minute. So generally what you'll find is that if you're looking at runners, your sprinters will tend to have 60 to 80% of your type 2s. Your marathon runners will have similar amounts, but this time of type 1, okay, because they're wanting to work for hours, they'll have those various types. As a general rule, your African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans, they possess less type 1 fibers than Caucasians. And of course, the type 1s have got more blood vessels supplying them. Training, it doesn't make one type turn into another one, but it does help them adapt. Okay, so that's based on your training, of course. So like I said, different, so you can slightly adapt them based on that, on your training. And different muscles in the body will have different proportions of each muscle type. So just think about it. Your back, your neck, and your leg, they have more type 1 muscles because they're being used on a constant basis all of the time. You have more type 2B in your arms because they're not being used so frequently. So they're more of those fast twitch glycolytic fibers. But on average, Joe Bloggs in the middle will have about 50% slow and 50% fast twitch fibers. So our genes can influence our genetic performance, and they can do it by many, many different ways. So they affect your VO2 max, your aerobic capacity. They affect your variety of enzymes, your glycolytic enzymes, etc., etc. And they influence, but as well as that, they influence our physical and sporting characteristics. So like I said, they have direct effect on our physical characteristics. So your heart size and your muscle composition, so your type 1, 2A, and 2B. Your predisposition towards certain physical characteristics, like your body type. And your body type influences how good you might be at a certain type of exercise. And then indirect effects on physical and physiological characteristics. So in other words, what's going on inside the individual cells and within the body systems. Okay, so we've talked before about angiotensin converting enzyme and its role in blood pressure, but actually there are different types of ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. And those different types, one type helps endurance performance, and another type, they're basically little mutations and changes in them, and a different type affects the sprint events, so the higher intensity events, the anaerobic events. So depending on which way your genetics lie, you actually get a susceptibility to one type of performance over another. And there are lots and lots of other genes involved in performance, and there are lots of other genes also involved in injury susceptibility as well. So we all have a variety of those different genes. We're just going to look at genetic influences in terms of body shape. Okay, just to get you, because the other areas are far too complex at this particular level. So anthropometry, that's the measurement of the body in order to help distinguish physical traits. And so therefore it's your somatotype. And it's really looking at the shape or the outer conformation of your body, regardless of your size. Okay, And as a person's somatotype, it's heavily dependent on genetic heritage, but also depend on your lifestyle, so what your diet is like, how much exercise you do, etc. And we have three main types that we're going to go through now. We have your ectomorphs, as you can see, they generally look thinner. You have your endomorphs, generally have a bit more weight around the waist and around the hips. And then your mesomorphs, which are generally more muscular. Okay, so if you're looking at these, you're kind of going, your ectomorphs probably look like they've got more type 1 muscle fibers, and your mesomorphs have got probably more type 2B muscle fibers. So first of all, let's look at the endomorphs. So your endomorphs, if we're looking at them, they tend to have a pear-shaped body. They tend to have a more rounded head with large bones. They tend to have wide hips and shoulders. They're wider front to back rather than side to side. And they have lots of fat on the body, the upper arms and the thighs. Great if you want to be a sumo wrestler. Then you've got your mesomorphs, your muscular types. So these are the guys with your wedge-shaped body, as you can see there, your wide, broad shoulders, so your high biochromial width, your narrow hips and your muscled arms, and your large bones with a solid torso combined with low fat levels. So they tend to have the lowest fat levels. And obviously you're looking at that, you can see sprinters with that muscular structure. And then you have your ectomorph, which are your slims. So these guys are going to have a higher forehead, receding chin, short upper body and narrow shoulders and hips, long arms and legs with long thin muscles and low fat storage. So again, we all know people who fit into the ectomorph, the endomorph and the mesomorphs. But now there's genetic basis behind it, and you're starting to think, hang on, which of these type of shape is better for what type of performance? And that's what I want you to look at. And I want you to have a little think about what is that best form. So if we're looking at these, so individuals, we're all classified by visual discrimination. So you'll look at someone and you'll go endomorph, and you'll go ectomorph, or you'll go mesomorph. But most people, the average person, contains traits from all three. And different sports may require different somatotypes. So shot putters need something different to gymnasts, need something to footballers, need something different to runners. And if you look at Joe Average, he's going to sit in the middle. Okay. So here you've got your mesomorph, you've got your ectomorph, and you've got your endomorph. And Joe Bloggs basically sits in the middle. So if you take the average of the entire population, he will sit, or she will sit, right in the middle there. So I just want you to now look at each of these. We'll go through them, and it's just my impression of roughly where they'll be. Okay, you might have a slightly different impression. Shouldn't be too different. But where do you think your high jumper will fit? Your tennis player, your sprinter, your weightlifter, your sumo wrestler, and your long distance runner. So have a little look at those and say what you think. So your high jumper, where does he go? So I put him down there. Okay, so he's in the middle, somewhere moving into the ectomorph zone. Okay, so quite tall and quite slim. Then got your tennis player. So they are a little bit more muscular. They're running around. They're having to do short sprints all the time. So they need a little bit more muscle, but they still have to be quite slim. Your sprinter. Again, much further up. Now we're moving really up towards the mesomorph area. Okay, so they're not huge mesomorphs. Okay, but they're mesomorphic because they need that power. Your weightlifter, they're going to be much higher up there. Okay, they've got that more mesomorphic structure, but a little bit of a moving to the left quite often with a little bit more fat floating around. Sumo wrestler, now I put him about there. You might put him a little bit lower down towards the endomorph zone. But the reality is that sumo wrestlers, they might have a lot of fat on them, but they still need to be quite strong. So they need more of that muscularity as well, rather than just pure large amounts of fat, if we want to think of it like that. And finally, your long distance runner is obviously moving far more down towards that ectomorph structure with more of the type 1 muscle fibers, the long muscle fibers that allow that long distance running. So what are some of those anthropometric traits that are important in different sports? Well, we've kind of just gone through it, and it's interesting to think about these things, because actually coaches are now looking at people's body shape to kind of predict what they might be good at later on and what they might be good to train at. So if you look at sprinters, it's actually very important that they have a good balance of leg length and cadence. So they need cadence, turnover, and good leg length. And there's Usain Bolt for you. And as a general rule, athletes of West African ancestry, see African Americans, see British blacks, etc., they tend to be more mesomorphic, so with those defined muscular physiques, with those strong upper and lower bodies. You then have your rowers. Okay, they need a long arm length to be able to pull those big strokes, and a high biochromial breadth is critical. So that length between the shoulder blades, the shoulder width, basically. And again, their lug muscles, as a general rule, will possess a high percentage of low twitch fibers than controls for endurance. So they're requiring that for that endurance to keep going for those longer rows, unless they're sprinters, of course, when it's slightly different.